the main focus.
Right. Nancy, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, let the record reflect that no other business was discussed other than what was contained in the agenda. Also, let the record reflect that at 8:03 PM, we reconvene to open session.
All right, 8.1, which is the potential board action to approve the tentative agreement between the Chicago Ridge Education Association, also known as CREA, and the Board of Education for the collective bargaining agreement for 2022-23, 23-24, 24-25, 25-26, and 26-27. Can we have a motion, please?
motion.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mr. Malkowski,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
And before we go on, I just wanted to thank both sides, both the board side and the CREA side. Obviously, there was a lot of time that went into this agreement, and I think it's beneficial for both the teachers and for our community. And so we're really excited to have this contract signed off. So thank you. All right, 8.2, potential board action to approve a memorandum of understanding with the Chicago Ridge Education Association and the Board of Education regarding retirement incentive. Can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion. I'll second.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mr. Malkowski,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
So we have the potential board action to approve pay increases for administrators and the school psychologists equal to the amount for CREA staff and the tentative collective bargaining agreement for our administrators. That includes Julie Bazian, Leanne Kazmarek, Jeff Youngberg, Kathy Picciolini, and Adam Thorns. Can we get a motion?
I'll make a motion.
I'll second the motion.
Mr. Malkowski,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
For 8.4, we have the potential board action to approve pay increases for employee stipends equal to the stipend increase in the tentative collective bargaining agreement. This includes stipends for the district courier, the board secretary, the pre-K program, the principal mentor, the pre-K secretary, and teacheries. Can we get a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Can we get a second?
I'll
Yeah.
second.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle. Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mr. Malkowski, Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
8.5, potential board action to approve an MOU with Crest regarding paid days off. Can we get a motion?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Grove, Mr. Malkowski,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
Can we get a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion. I'll second. 8:07.
Mrs. Grove,
Aye.
Mrs. Lammle,
Aye.
Mrs. Petropoulos,
Aye.
Mrs. Lebudzick,
Aye.
Mr. Malkowski,
Aye.
and Mrs. Salzer.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great